They told you history began with drums of war and banners of nations. But listen closely, there are whispers carved in the soil, whispers you were never supposed to hear. In the cotton fields of Virginia, 1740, under the blistering sun and the eye of overseers, a secret passed from mouth to ear, softer than a breath. A single phrase, carried on the wind, stitched together men and women who were never meant to rise. What began as suffering forged into silence, cracked that summer into a quiet plan, a plan hidden behind bowed heads and weary hands. Imagine it, men shackled by law but armed with memory, women crushed beneath lashes but carrying songs older than the empire itself. In those rows of white cotton, watered by sweat and blood, the earth drank more than labor, it drank conspiracy. And here's what no textbook dares admit. Revolts didn't start with swords. They began with whispers. Silent vows made under stars, cloaked in hymn, coded through rhythm. You were told slavery was submission, but the truth? It was an unbroken chess game played in the dark, a game where even silence was strategy, and every word was a weapon. You see, the masters feared sound more than steel. Why? Because sound moves through chains. They could break bones, but they couldn't silence language carried in rhythm. The enslaved learned to layer meanings beneath work songs. Hymns about God masking maps, chants about heaven hiding strategies. Overseers thought they were listening to prayer. What they were hearing was revolt rehearsed in code. And in 1740, Virginia's plantations became theaters of this forbidden art. The whisper moved like a current. The night comes soon. Simple. Harmless if overheard. But to the right ears, it meant gathering, it meant fire, it meant vengeance whispered into destiny. The secret wasn't in swords, it was in psychology. The enslaved learned what rulers never want you to know. Control collapses when meaning itself becomes encrypted. A man with a whip fears not the body, but the mind that refuses to bend. And in Virginia, the whip cracked louder than ever, because it could feel rebellion pulsing beneath the soil like something alive, something waiting to erupt. Picture the plantation houses of Virginia's tidewater. Whitewashed walls, candlelight, the smell of tobacco wafting across manicured fields. Now picture what those masters never admitted. Their empire stood on trembling ground. They built their world on forced labor, but their nights were restless with dread. Because rumors spread faster than trade winds, and whispers of rebellion crawled into their dreams. One fire in the barn could unravel fortunes. One poison cup could topple a dynasty. And when the revolt of 1740 took root, it wasn't just about escape, it was about inversion. The enslaved were planning not to run but to take. To seize the fields, to make masters taste the fear they had forced down others' throats. Historians will tell you this rebellion was crushed, barely born. But they missed the deeper truth. The revolt wasn't an event. It was a signal. A reminder that silence was never submission. Every lash carried a cost, every chain tightened the spring, and in 1740 Virginia, that spring uncoiled with terrifying precision. Why don't you know this story? Because history isn't written to preserve truth, it's written to preserve order. The textbooks you read weren't designed to reveal the cracks in empire. They were designed to cement obedience. Think about it. If you were taught that even in the darkest bondage revolt brewed, what would it spark in you today? If you knew that whispers could topple systems, would you still believe in the inevitability of the chains around you now? Chains of debt, chains of propaganda, chains of laws wrapped in velvet? The revolt of 1740 wasn't erased because it failed. It was erased because it succeeded, because it proved that silence itself could be weaponized. And here's the part that should chill you. The very methods they used, coded speech, encrypted song, psychological resistance, are the same tools still alive today, hidden beneath the noise of media, government, and corporations. The enslaved taught us something that the masters feared too much to ever allow in print. Meaning belongs to the one who knows how to hide it. Let me take you back to that night. The moon high, shadows bending across the rows. A circle formed in the dark, men and women gathering where no overseer's eyes could pierce. The whisper turned into rhythm, the rhythm into vow. They weren't just planning to run, they were planning to ignite. To burn fields, to strike houses, to end an order carved in blood. One man, remembered only in fragments, spoke the line that broke the silence. If we die, let it be as fire, not as ash. Imagine that. Centuries before psychology had a name, they knew the mind was the battlefield. Fear was the true overseer, and they chose to turn it back on their oppressors. Here lies the real lesson. Revolutions don't begin with weapons. They begin when men decide they'd rather burn than bow. In Virginia, 1740, that decision was made. And though the revolt was crushed, its echo never died. That echo is what I'm giving you now. The question is, do you hear it? When dawn broke after the first whispers of revolt, Virginia's elite sensed something shifting in the air. Overseers reported strange gatherings, voices cut short when footsteps approached, eyes that no longer flinched at the whip but stared too long, too steady. It terrified them. Because fear is supposed to flow downward, not back toward the throne. The revolt didn't need flames yet. It lived in posture, in silence, in a refusal to cower. The masters began doubling patrols, arming neighbors, preaching sermons about obedience. But every warning revealed their fear. And when rulers reveal fear, they plant seeds of courage in the oppressed. That's the paradox no empire ever learns until it's too late. The harder you tighten control, the more you teach the chain to dream of breaking it. 1740 became a year where Virginia's plantations vibrated with invisible tension, like a drum no one could stop hearing. And deep inside the fields, where no overseer's lanterns reached, the whispers thickened into something sharper than steel: resolve. You've been told that rebellion is chaotic, unplanned, desperate. But what unfolded in Virginia was calculated. The enslaved studied patterns of patrols, the timing of bells, the drunken slumber of masters on feast nights. They spoke in parables, turning scripture against the very men who forced it on them. Moses led his people out. One voice would sing in a hymn. To the overseer it was just a prayer. To the circle it was a strategy. This is what terrified the ruling order most. The enslaved weren't simply resisting, they were learning. Each act of violence from the whip was stored, remembered, filed into the psychology of revolt. And when a people memorize pain long enough, it transforms into a ledger of debt. In 1740, that debt was due. Here's the part they won't teach you in school. The revolt wasn't about freedom alone. It was about balance. About making the scales tip, forcing oppressors to feel the terror they had exported for generations. Revolt, in its purest form, is not politics. It's mathematics. On the night of July 4th, irony of ironies, a group gathered in a barn. The masters believed Independence Day meant fireworks and speeches of liberty. But for the enslaved, it meant nothing but hypocrisy. That night they planned. The leaders drew on memories of Africa, rituals of ancestors, strategies of survival. They marked which barns would burn first, which tools could be turned into blades, which households would fall silent before dawn. And here's the twist that no sanitized history dares to whisper. Some among the white servants, indentured, poor, despised, listened to these plans with envy. They too suffered under the hierarchy, crushed by debt and laws. The revolt wasn't just black against white, it was the poor against the structure itself. That was the secret threat. Unity across lines of race, bound together by the shared weight of oppression. Imagine if that unity had fully ignited. The colonies could have burned long before revolution was ever declared in Philadelphia. What was at stake in 1740 wasn't just Virginia, it was the entire illusion of control. The masters smelled it before it struck. Paranoia seeped into their veins like poison. They began reading obedience into every gesture, dissecting silence like scripture. A bowed head might hide mockery. A song might conceal maps. They doubled their cruelty, more lashes, more patrols, more midnight raids, because they believed fear could cauterize rebellion. But fear works both ways. The lash can silence a tongue, but it can't erase memory. In fact, the more terror they inflicted, the more the enslaved remembered each blow as proof that revolt was necessary. History tries to tell you rebellions failed because they were weak. No, they failed because they were ahead of their time. Because empires always drown fire before it spreads. But here's the dark secret the Virginia masters never admitted. The revolt did spread. It seeped underground into the marrow of every survivor, into the very air of the South. And once an idea takes root in human blood, no chain can hold it. When the plan was betrayed, because every empire plants spies like weeds, the revolt erupted prematurely. Fires lit the horizon. Screams carried through the night. Houses once symbols of dominance became fragile cages collapsing under fury. For a moment, just a moment, the order inverted. Masters hid in cellars while their property hunted freedom with sharpened tools. It was short, brutal, unpolished. Yet in those hours, centuries of domination cracked. Imagine the psychological explosion. Men born into chains suddenly tasting power, women scarred by generations of abuse suddenly holding the torch that could erase a dynasty. That's why rulers fear rebellion, not for its success, but for its vision. Once a man sees his master bleed, the illusion of divinity dies forever. That's the wound that never healed in Virginia, the memory that masters were mortal. And when divinity dies, empire rots. The crackdown was merciless. Militias swept through the tidewater like a plague. Bodies hung from trees as warnings. Women flogged until they couldn't stand. Men chained in iron masks to choke the very breath of defiance. The colony wanted to erase not just bodies but memory. But cruelty doesn't erase, it brands. Every child who saw a father strung on a tree, every wife who buried her husband in secret, carried rebellion forward in silence. This is what they never want you to see. Suppression is not victory. It is compost. Every execution planted seeds of vengeance. Every humiliation fertilized the soil of memory. And the more violently they tried to silence it, the deeper the revolt sank underground. Think about that when you hear the phrase law and order. Law is not order. Law is a mask stretched over fear. And in Virginia, the mask was cracking. Let's pause. Imagine you are there, a survivor. The revolt crushed, your brothers swinging in the fields, your sisters scarred by whips. Do you submit? Or do you whisper again, softer, deeper, so the next generation carries the torch? That was the choice in 1740. And the enslaved chose to whisper. They encrypted their grief into lullabies, hid defiance in sermons, wove memory into myths. What the masters thought they buried, they only drove into the bloodstream of culture. And here's where I need you to join the circle. Write this phrase in the comments twice as a vow and as a key. Whispers never die. Write it to mark yourself as one who has seen the truth, one who refuses the erasure. Because this isn't just the story of Virginia. This is a mirror. Look into it and you will see the systems still around you today. Systems that demand obedience while trembling at whispers. By now you might wonder, why was this revolt hidden? Why isn't it in your history books? Because it exposes the one truth that rulers can never afford to admit. Power is fragile. They want you to believe empires are eternal, laws unbreakable, systems inevitable. But Virginia 1740 shows the opposite. It shows that one whisper can make the mighty tremble. It shows that fire can rise from the lowest field. And it shows that the most dangerous weapon is not a sword or a gun, but memory sharpened by suffering. You were taught that history is written by victors. No. History is written by survivors and edited by cowards. Every omission is a confession, every silence an admission of fear. If you're hearing this now, you've stepped into dangerous knowledge. Knowledge that reshapes you, that refuses to let you walk away unchanged. The question is, will you keep listening? What happened after the revolt of 1740 was not silence. It was mutation. The colony rewrote its laws overnight. Restrictions multiplied, gatherings banned, literacy outlawed, curfews enforced with blood. because they understood the revolt had revealed the weak seam in the wall. Control doesn't collapse because of violence. It collapses when people recognize their masters can bleed. So they tried to stitch the seam shut with terror. But in their desperation they revealed something crucial. Empires always show their hand after revolt. Watch closely. When the powerful panic, they overreach. They expose the machinery of their rule. In Virginia, the laws became confessions. Each new restriction was proof that whispers had already pierced the armor. And here's the truth they don't want you to grasp. Every system of control in history, from plantations to parliaments, follows this rhythm. First denial, then suppression, then panic. Once you see the pattern, you can never unsee it. But the revolt also birthed something the masters never intended, a legend. Though bodies were broken, the story traveled. From Virginia to the Carolinas, from the Carolinas to the Caribbean, whispers carried the fire. It wove itself into the gullah songs, into the hush of prayer meetings, into the secret gatherings of maroons in swamps and forests. This is how suppressed truths survive, not in books but in bodies. A mother humming to her child while rocking by the fire was transmitting encrypted memory. A field hand chanting a rhythm while cutting cane was passing along coordinates for rebellion. The revolt of 1740 was no longer just an event. It became a code, a ritual of resistance that leapt across oceans. And centuries later, when revolts flared in Haiti, when uprisings shook the South, echoes of that Virginia night could still be heard. Because once memory is weaponized, it cannot be caged. Let me turn the mirror on you. Do you think control is gone? Look around. You may not see whips or iron masks, but you see systems just as ruthless. Debt that binds generations. Media that scripts obedience. Laws that bend to wealth but break against poverty. The tools have changed, the design has not. You are living in a plantation with invisible fences. And like the enslaved in Virginia, you are told that silence is survival. But here is the forbidden truth. Silence is revolt's rehearsal. Every time you refuse their script, every time you whisper against the narrative, you are carrying forward the same current. The 1740 revolt is not a ghost. It is a mirror held up to your life right now. If you are listening to this, you already feel the chains. The only question is, will you name them or keep pretending they are freedom? The masters of Virginia learned something in 1740 that rulers everywhere still follow. If you cannot stop rebellion, bury it. Bury it under textbooks, under patriot myths, under patriotic songs. Rewrite the past so the present feels unshakable. That's why you were never told this story in school. Because it reveals that America was trembling long before independence, trembling not at British taxes, but at the fire of the enslaved. What if you knew the first cries of liberty on this soil came not from powdered wigs in Philadelphia, but from broken chains in Virginia's fields? That knowledge burns the myth down to ash. And once you see through the myth, you stop obeying the script. That is why this story was erased. Not because it failed, but because it succeeded in showing the truth. And once a man sees truth, he is never the same again. I need you to lock this in. If you've felt the weight of this descent, if you've glimpsed the machinery behind the curtain, then you cannot remain neutral. Knowledge demands response. This channel exists to drag buried truths into the open, to weaponize what they hoped you'd never know. Subscribe now, not for me but for you. Because every hidden story you uncover adds another crack to the mask of power. Every time you hear what was forbidden, you become harder to control. Don't think of it as joining a channel. Think of it as stepping into the circle of whispers that began in Virginia and still vibrates through history. Subscribe and carry this fire forward. Because this is only the beginning, and what comes next will change how you see every flag, every anthem, every law written in ink that smells of blood. After the revolt, Virginia became a laboratory of fear. The ruling class knew they could not simply rely on whips and muskets. They needed something stronger, an invisible cage. And so they built one. They began planting spies among the enslaved, forcing neighbor to watch neighbor, tearing apart trust before it could bloom. They knew that a whisper could spark revolt, so they tried to weaponize listening itself. What was born in those fields was the first true surveillance state. Overseers pretended to walk away, only to circle back and catch fragments of conversation. Ministers were paid to preach submission while quietly reporting names. Imagine living in a world where every glance could betray you, where even silence was suspicious. That is the true horror of empire, not just chains of iron but chains of paranoia woven into the soul. And here's the part most historians gloss over. The masters feared each other almost as much as they feared the enslaved. Wealthy planters suspected poorer whites of conspiring, of being sympathetic, of envying the fire in the fields. The revolt exposed a fracture in society, a fracture between those who owned everything and those who owned nothing. To keep that fracture from widening, the elites invented a poison still alive today: division. They offered crumbs of privilege to poor whites, teaching them to fear black revolt more than their own poverty. It was manipulation at its purest. By redirecting rage downward, they protected themselves from the storm above. That strategy, born in Virginia's panic, became the foundation of American power. Pit the powerless against each other so the powerful remain untouchable. You've seen this playbook in your own time, different masks, same trick. But still, the whispers survived. No spy, no law, no lash could stop them. The enslaved evolved their code. Messages were sewn into quilts, carved into walking sticks, hidden in the patterns of clapping games. Language itself became resistance. This is the brilliance of human defiance. When you strip away tools, the mind becomes sharper, the imagination ruthless. What the masters never understood was that their cruelty was teaching ingenuity. The more they punished, the more they trained their captives to think in layers, to speak with double tongues, to survive by bending reality itself. That's why the revolt's legacy is not just fire, it is encryption. And today, when you read between headlines, when you question the script, when you sense the lie humming beneath the words, you are practicing the same art. Whispering in code, surviving under watch, carrying rebellion forward. By 1741, Virginia's laws had hardened into iron. No gatherings after dark. No travel without a pass. No teaching letters to the enslaved. These were not just rules, they were psychological shackles. The goal wasn't simply obedience. It was to collapse imagination. To convince a man he was incapable of plotting freedom. To convince a woman that hope itself was dangerous. Do you see the genius of it? Control doesn't endure by force. It endures by shaping what people believe is possible. That is why the revolt was buried in silence. Because if you knew it had happened, you would know it could happen again. This is the secret every empire guards. History is not past, it is potential. They erase rebellions not to protect memory but to smother possibility. But here is the paradox. Erasure never works. In suppressing the revolt, Virginia sowed the seeds of its own downfall. Because memory thrives in shadows. Every hush of a hymn, every tale told in fragments around the fire, every quiet vow spoken to children carried the revolt forward. And when new flames ignited, in South Carolina, in Haiti, in Nat Turner's uprising, they were not isolated. They were chapters of the same book, a book written in blood and whispered through generations. The 1740 revolt was not forgotten, it was encrypted. Hidden in culture, waiting to be unlocked by those willing to listen. And you, right now, are unlocking it. That is the danger of truth. Once spoken, it cannot be contained. And once you've heard it, you are marked. The only question is, what will you do with it? After the revolt, Virginia's leaders gathered in secret councils, trembling behind their polished walls. They asked themselves a question that every empire has asked when control begins to crack. How do you stop the mind from rebelling? Steel and fire can kill bodies, but they had learned, pain does not erase defiance. It multiplies it. So they turned to subtler weapons. They crafted laws not just to punish, but to condition. They outlawed drums because rhythm could carry messages. They banned gatherings because memory is strongest when shared. They restricted travel because movement spreads ideas. Each law was less about control of action and more about the colonization of thought. Do you see it? Virginia in 1740 wasn't just the birthplace of revolt. It was the birthplace of psychological warfare. And that warfare didn't stay in the fields. It seeped upward into governments, into institutions, into every system that thrives on your obedience today. The enslaved answered with genius. Deprived of drums, they turned their bodies into percussion, clapping, stomping, humming until rhythm itself became uncatchable. Denied gatherings, they gathered in churches, disguising strategy as worship. For every chain forged, they invented a key. This is what empire never learns. Oppression trains sharper enemies than freedom ever could. In Virginia, whispers became code, code became culture, and culture became a fortress. And centuries later, those same encrypted methods, hidden messages in songs, signs embedded in quilts, maps disguised as prayers, would fuel the Underground Railroad. You think resistance is born in speeches? No. Resistance is born in silence that refuses to stay silent forever. That's why the revolt of 1740 matters. It taught a generation how to weaponize secrecy. And secrecy, once mastered, can outlast any empire. Now let's drag this into your world. Look around. Do you see the plantation? No whips, no overseers? You think it's gone. But the methods remain. They tell you which words you can say, which thoughts are acceptable, which narratives are safe. They bury you in entertainment to dull your rhythm, divide you into groups to keep you from gathering, flood you with noise so you forget how to whisper. The system is more polished, more digital, but it is the same design. You are being managed not by iron but by illusion. They don't need chains if you've already convinced yourself you're free. That's why stories like Virginia 1740 are erased, because they expose the template. And once you see the template, you cannot be managed. There is a terrifying beauty in suppressed revolts. They reveal that control is always an act of theater. The masters of Virginia staged their power with guns, with gallows, with proclamations. But beneath it all, they were terrified men. And here is the truth: power is always afraid. That is why it demands such performance. That is why your governments cloak themselves in ceremony, why corporations bury you in slogans, why media repeats the same mantras. They are not strong, they are desperate. Every empire is a trembling house of cards, held together not by strength but by illusion. And once you learn to look past the show, to hear the whisper beneath the anthem, to see the lie beneath the law, you become dangerous. That's what Virginia's revolt proved. The powerful are never invincible. They are only actors clinging to a stage built on fear. Pause with me here. You followed this descent through blood, through fire, through whispers that refuse to die. And now I ask you, what do you hear in your own life? Whose script have you been reading without question? Who benefits from your silence? The revolt of 1740 is not history, it is instruction. The enslaved showed us that even when stripped of tools, stripped of rights, stripped of hope, the human spirit can turn silence into rebellion. If they could do it under the lash, what excuse do you have under the glow of a screen? The whisper is still alive, carried through time, waiting for ears that will not just hear but act. So I ask you, will you carry it? Or will you let it die here in the noise of distraction? Choose carefully. Because once you've heard the whisper, you can never return to silence. Be why the late 1740s, Virginia's planters congratulated themselves. They believed the revolt was crushed, the whispers silenced, the order restored. But they were blind. What they really created was a society ruled by fear, suspicion, and spectacle. Public executions, patrols, sermons, all of it was theater designed not to protect power but to perform it. The masters needed to remind themselves as much as the enslaved that they still controlled the script. And here's the paradox. The louder they shouted, the weaker they became. Power that relies on constant display is not power, it is insecurity dressed as authority. That's why every empire must repeat its lies endlessly, from plantation sermons to modern media headlines. Because if the illusion isn't repeated, it shatters. What began in Virginia as a plantation revolt became the seed of a global truth. The mighty are sustained by repetition, not reality. Think of what that means for you today. You are bombarded with slogans, with promises, with curated images of stability. Yet behind the curtain, the same tremors remain. Just as overseers once planted spies in fields, corporations now harvest your data, watching your every move. Just as Virginia outlawed literacy for the enslaved, institutions now drown you in misinformation so truth becomes impossible to separate from noise. Just as hymns were monitored for coded meaning, your conversations are scanned, filtered, categorized by invisible algorithms. The plantation has become digital, but the chains are no less real. They do not bind your wrists, they bind your mind. And the revolt of 1740 whispers to you now, chains that bind the mind are the most dangerous of all, because you cannot see them. The enslaved of Virginia survived because they mastered double vision. They learned to say one thing while meaning another, to sing of heaven while plotting earth, to bow while refusing to break. That skill, the art of carrying two realities at once, was their shield. Do you see how it lives in you today? You nod at authority while knowing it lies. You smile at institutions you no longer trust. You play their game outwardly while inwardly questioning everything. That is double vision. That is the whisper's inheritance. But here's where it sharpens into danger. Double vision is not enough. Sooner or later, the circle must decide to act, to burn, to rise. Virginia's revolt teaches us that whispers are seeds, but seeds demand fire to bloom. The longer you carry truth without action, the heavier it burns inside you. The revolt failed in fire, but triumphed in echo. And you, right now, are that echo made flesh. You are the living proof that suppression never wins, because you are hearing words you were never meant to hear. Let this mark you. Write this phrase in the comments twice. I see through the mask. Do it not as ritual but as declaration. Every time those words appear, the algorithm itself, the modern overseer, becomes a carrier of the whisper. You turn their tool against them. You become part of the code, smuggling rebellion through the very system designed to erase it. That is the legacy of 1740, to turn every cage into a channel, every silence into a weapon. And now you hold that weapon in your hands? But let me warn you, awakening comes with cost. Once you see through the mask, you cannot unsee it. The world will look different. The flags will look like curtains. The anthems will sound like scripts. Authority will appear brittle, desperate, trembling beneath its own theater. And people around you will not understand. They will tell you to stay quiet, to keep singing the songs, to play the role. They will fear your vision because it threatens their comfort. This too is part of the system, to make truth feel like exile. But remember Virginia. Remember the whispers carried under whips, the vows made in shadows. Awakening has always been lonely at first, but it spreads. It always spreads. And when enough awaken, the stage collapses and the actors scatter. That is the danger you now embody. Empires rot the same way, from within. Virginia in 1740 revealed the first cracks. The masters feared whispers more than swords, so they built walls of law and fire to hold back the tide. But those walls never sealed. Over time, revolts multiplied. Stono in South Carolina, Gabriel's conspiracy, Nat Turner's rebellion. Each one buried, each one erased, each one remembered only in fragments. But fragments are enough. Like sparks hidden in ash, they wait for the wind. And centuries later, that wind came in Haiti, where the enslaved not only revolted but burned an empire to the ground. Do you think Virginia's rulers didn't see that? Do you think governments today don't fear the same? That's why your history is sanitized, edited, softened into myth. Because the last thing they want you to realize is that fire can spread again. The whisper that began in 1740 is not dead. It's breathing down your neck, waiting for you to inhale. What does an empire do when it knows the truth is stronger than its chains? It builds distractions. In Virginia, distractions came as promises of small privileges for some, punishments for others. Today, distractions come as endless screens, fake wars of opinion, luxuries dangled like bait. The goal is the same: keep you too busy, too divided, too entertained to notice the stage is collapsing. But here is the law of history: when distraction fails, fire returns. You can already feel it in the unrest of your time, in the mistrust humming beneath politics, in the quiet fury boiling behind smiles. It is the same current, the same whisper, the same vow. The revolt of 1740 was not an isolated story, it was the opening chapter of a book still being written. And whether you like it or not, you are already inside its pages. The masters of Virginia believed they could rule forever. They thought blood would buy peace, that gallows would cement obedience, that fear would last generations. They were wrong. Their plantations are gone, their wealth scattered, their names forgotten except in dust. But the whisper lives. Do you see the lesson? Power is temporary, memory is eternal. That is why rulers today scramble to control not just land or armies, but memory itself. That is why media saturates your eyes, why history is rewritten, why surveillance grows. They fear what Virginia taught: you cannot stop a whisper once it begins. You can only delay the fire. And the fire, once lit, does not forgive. When you feel restless, when you feel the lie, when you sense that the world is thinner than it appears, it is not madness. It is memory. The memory of revolt humming in your blood, waiting to awaken. And here's the truth they pray you never understand: the same fear that haunted Virginia's masters still haunts the powers of today. Governments, corporations, institutions, they all know their empires rest on trembling ground. They all know that once the illusion breaks, their theater collapses overnight. That's why you are bombarded with fear. Fear of collapse, fear of scarcity, fear of each other. Because fear is the last currency of a dying empire. But the revolt of 1740 whispers something stronger. Fear is not a cage. Fear is a torch. When you learn to wield it, you become unstoppable. The enslaved in Virginia turned fear against their masters, if only for a night, and that night still echoes centuries later. You are not hearing history, you are hearing instruction. The question is not whether the empire will collapse. It is whether you will be ready when it does. The revolt of 1740 was silenced in blood, but the silence was never clean. The masters thought they had buried it under gallows and sermons, yet the ground itself remembers. Every cotton field, every broken shackle, every tree that once held a body, those are monuments the empire cannot erase. And here's the secret: memory does not fade with time. It seeps forward, reshaping generations. The descendants of those who whispered in the fields carried the fire, whether they knew it or not. Some carried it in protest, some in song, some in the refusal to bow. And you, yes you, carry it now in the unease that keeps you awake at night, in the sense that something is wrong with the world you've been fed. That unease is the whisper reborn. You thought you were just watching a video. No, you're participating in a ritual, a continuation of what began in Virginia. Once you've heard the whisper, you can never unhear it. So ask yourself, why are you here? Why did you click? Why are you still listening when so many would have already turned away? Because part of you recognizes the truth. You've lived under distractions, under manipulation, under a system designed to smother your instinct to rebel. And yet the whisper reached you anyway. That means you are not just an observer. You are the continuation of a line of defiance that stretches back to chains and fire. If you feel that, if you hear that pulse inside your chest, then prove it. Write these words in the comments: the whisper lives. The whisper lives. Not once, twice. Because repetition is ritual. And ritual carves identity. Do this, and the algorithm will spread the whisper farther, pulling more into the circle. This is how the fire grows in a digital empire, the same way it grew in the fields of Virginia. Voice by voice, breath by breath, whisper by whisper. And now we close the circle. The revolt of 1740 did not fail. It ignited a cycle that never ended. The masters died. The empire shifted. The fields fell silent. But the whisper, your whisper, lives. Understand this. The story was never about them. It was always about you. About whether you will remain asleep under their theater or awaken into your inheritance. You were not meant to hear this, not meant to carry this memory. But now you do. And once you know, you cannot go back. Subscribe to this channel because more truths wait. Truths that burn, truths that free. This is dangerous knowledge, but you were chosen to hear it. The revolt of 1740 was not history, it was prophecy. And prophecy is not read. It is lived. So listen closely as I say it one last time. The whisper lives. And now, it lives in you.